Hello and welcome to this edition of Bayou Time. I'm your host, Keith Whiteside, licensed clinical social worker. So very glad to be joining you. So very glad you are watching or listening, or however you may be joining us. We appreciate it here at HTV. We also appreciate our local leadership, those guys that are really fighting for us, for our rights, and for making sure that our future continues the way we want and need it to. We welcome back to the program State Representative Jerome Zeringue. Z, thanks for being here.
Good morning, Keith. Thanks for having me.
All right, we appreciate it. Look, there's so much going on, but the governor really just kind of put through the new budget, right?
That's right. So every year prior to the start of session, 30 days before, the governor is required to provide their executive budget,
okay,
of which we then, the legislature, and then all fiscal instruments have to generate in the House.
Okay.
So we will prepare the budget. Basically, a lot of what we have is just recommendations from the governor and then the body, both the House and the Senate, then prepare it and then hopefully work through the whole issue and finally get the ultimate budget, which is constitutionally obligated to be balanced. We have to have a balanced budget.
Balanced budget, right.
Yes, sir.
But a lot of people think, man, a whole lot of money, we got a surplus now. That's a little bit misleading. We were talking a little bit about that. Let's talk about all these extra federal funds that are coming in and the importance of trying to figure out what to do with that and making a long-term plan with that.
Sure, and just kind of put the numbers in perspective. Right now, we have over $699 million of surplus dollars. So there's several pots of money.
Okay.
First being surplus.
Right.
And surplus is essentially money that last fiscal year wasn't spent, but it's constitutionally obligated to be spent on 6 certain things. That is defeasance of debt, the rainy day fund, the unfunded accrued liability, the liability for retirement plans.
Right.
It can be used for infrastructure like roads and bridges, and fortunately for us, coastal projects.
Right.
Of which there's $150 million that we hope to use here.
Right, right. And so those are some of the places where that money needs to go. But we've got to be careful about making the plan for that.
That's right. So that kind of limits somewhat how that can be spent. Where it starts getting a bit dicey is then the next pot of money is what's called excess.
Okay.
Now, excess is the money that was projected. Well, first off, like the REC, and we could talk about that, that's the Revenue Estimating Conference, who basically are economists and representatives from the Senate, the Senate President and the Speaker of the House and the administration, get together and basically say, based upon the projections, the economy, what we hope to get in sales tax, revenue, and everything else, you can spend or budget this. And that's the number we use to budget. Well, last year they were conservative because of the pandemic and everything else. And so the difference between what was projected and what was realized in this fiscal year is excess. And in excess, we have over $1.2 billion. That is because most of it attributed to a lot of the federal dollars, which increased corporate taxes, personal income taxes have bumped that up.
Right.
So right off the bat, we have a $400 million, and we can spend the rest of the few days talking about why that's a problem, but $400 million that's going to pay the non-federal cost share for the New Orleans and vicinity hurricane protection system, of which we'd love to get.
Yeah,
don't get me started on that.
I won't.
Don't get me started.
won't.
But be that as
the
it
levy
may.
boards have kind of talked
yes.
about that in great detail.
And I passed legislation to address that last session, and that's why it's coming off the general fund and not supposedly the state wanted to borrow it, put us even more in debt that which affects our ability for projects. So we can talk about how that's a problem, but I think we've addressed that. So they'll get that.
Okay.
So that comes right off the top for excess. So that leaves about $800 million, of which the governor made recommendations, and we could talk about some of the specifics, but they're simply recommendations. The legislature ultimately determines how that's going to be spent. And then the next or third pot is the executive budget. And that's what we plan for next fiscal year, starting July 1st. And the projection, so the REC recognizes excess money for this current year, but they also project what you can spend next year.
Right.
And they've increased what we can spend based upon the dollars that are there, over $700 million than what we spent last year. And that's where the challenge and the rub is we need to be aware that a lot of this increase is related to or influenced by the federal dollars that were infused into the budget. And we can't increase government, or you now saying, well, now we have $700 million to spend in the budget, so let's start adding programs.
Yeah, right.
Which sounds
let's add a
great.
$700 million program.
Well, exactly.
And
if
you
the
can't
economy,
do that.
and if the economy, if it weren't for the federal dollars and the economy was improving, those are recurring dollars that you can project and say, you know what, we can do these things. We can increase education, all these other good things that we need to do, healthcare. But the projection is within the next 3 years, there will be deficits because when that federal dollar, they're no longer coming in, there are negative growth factors for the next 3 years. And not to mention in 2025, 0.45 of the sales tax rolls off.
Right.
That's going to be a
Goes
$400
away.
million deficit right there that we have to address. Either you're going to increase taxes, which nobody
ever wants to do, right?
And the other hit to that was we passed legislation, and Representative McGee was a sponsor of this, and it's great in terms of we're now taking the auto sales tax that's generated, the money from sales tax is roughly around, it's going to increase the amount allocated to it.
Right.
But it's going to be about $150 million, then it goes to $300 million, and it's going to be roughly around, from here on out, about $300 million to go to infrastructure, which is needed for roads and bridges, because it's cars and it makes sense. So it's great legislation, but the reality is so instead of going to the general fund, it's now going to infrastructure.
It's specifically allocated to the infrastructure.
That's right. So the general fund will have a deficit in 3 years, the $400 million from the quarter, and then the $300 million from the auto tax being redirected, over close to $700 million. And so we're going to have to be prepared for that.
Right. And it takes that projection, it takes us looking at what is there now, what's going to come in projection, and how to plan for the future. So it's a delicate balance, and that's why there's so many checks and balances to it. And so, Z, we appreciate you explaining it that way, breaking it down for somebody like me who doesn't understand numbers very well, who can do that. And so we appreciate that. You know, we were talking a little bit about the budget. It was one of the things you wanted to mention about the budget.
Sure. So part of the money that we have, and we still have $1.3 billion to expend this legislative session, is the American Rescue dollars. And there were 3.1 that were allocated, those federal dollars. We used 1.6 last session, part of which 300 million were put to water sector programs for clean water. It's amazing. You know, look, some of the rural areas in North Louisiana, they're bathing and drinking in brown water. It's bad, and that's one of the critical areas. And not just up in North Louisiana. We have a critical issue here in Terrebonne Parish, and I'm happy to say Mike and the guys at Consolidated Waterworks submitted an application, and we went through the scoring process, and at the last JLCB meeting, we just made the recommendation to spend the $300 million. But part of which there's a project in Terrebonne Parish over $5 million to address some of the infrastructure needs for our water system, which would be great. So we also, of that 1.3 that we have left, we're going to allocate probably, the governor in his budget put over $500 million, close to $600 million. I don't know if the legislature is willing to commit that much of the remaining 1.3, but we'll put at least more than what we put in the 300. So there's a lot of critical infrastructure, water and sewer projects that will be funded this upcoming year.
Yeah, and look, we only see those problem areas when we have a storm, or we see those problem areas when we have some event that affects electricity, but it's always good to know that we're improving water and sewage. That's part of the infrastructure that we really need to make sure we sustain.
And we're unique in South Louisiana for many respects, but you know, our soil conditions and everything else make us more both vulnerable and are unique in terms of how we approach our infrastructure needs, from bridges to roads and everything else.
Yeah, the chemistry of that soil makes it very, very difficult. Now, that's some of the changes that are taking place, but this redistricting has been a really interesting topic. I know we've had a new legislative session about it, but let's just talk about what it means and how it's impacting you guys. You're one of the ones that's most impacted by redistricting.
Yes. My district is one of the few districts in the region that actually grew.
Right.
A little over 2,000, close to 3,000, between 2,000 and 3,000 people. So I'm going to have to consolidate and shrink my district somewhat. Representative McGee, Representative Joe Ogeron, Representative Fontenot in Lafourche, his grew a little bit too, so he's going to have to give up. But Representative Amity, Ogeron, and McGee are going to have to, we have to restructure those things. So there's going to be some changes in terms of the district lines, and that's where the rub is. Overall, in the state, the number per legislative district, we actually grew in population. Everybody thinks we lost. We only grew about less than the national average. It was small. So the average number of people per district has increased. It was a little over 32,000. Now it's close to 40,000 per district.
Okay, wow.
So New Orleans grew, and there's going to have to be an additional seat in New Orleans.
Right.
But they're going to have to take it probably from somewhere in North Louisiana where the rural areas, and that's where it's going to be a challenge. The biggest challenge, though, is going to be in the congressional districts.
Right, right.
And there is some discussion in terms of how we approach it. The North really can't support in terms of having the districts, but there's a lot of interest to try to keep it as it is. So there'll be some intense discussion. So we go into session next week. We start February 1st. We get called into session, and we have 3 weeks to work on the maps. And it's not just, it's Senate, House of Representatives, Bessie. It's going to be congressional districts, and we're going to look at judicial districts as well.
Okay. And I'm simply minded, so what I took from that is that people are wanting to move into your district because they want you to be their representative.
I'd like to think that. I doubt that's the case. But I think it's what it is because, looking at the impacts of the storms, but we have to credit the levee district and the parish and working to make some advances to provide the protection. Again, it's not so much to protect everybody from everything, but to ensure that you have something to come back to. And
Right.
they've made great strides in that protection. I think the vulnerability and the insecurity that was there in living in the lower portion of the parish is going to be minimized and reduced as we continue to improve the hurricane protection system, which is it's great. It's demonstrated its ability to save and protect this region, and the more we do and invest in it, of which, again, as I mentioned, some of those dollars from surplus,
Right.
we have working and going to supporting the levee district on making those advancements that we need.
Right, and kind of finishing that Merganza to the Gulf project. And we've talked a lot about it with those monies that have been approved and those federal dollars. And,
That's right.
and people don't always understand, but the federal dollars really make a huge difference for what it allows us to do. And, the state's done a great job, and you, the representatives, have done a great job at making sure that we've had matching funds for that program. And those are some of the things they give you the leeway to do. Some things you can, some things you can't. And this redistricting is something that we look at every
10 years.
10 years.
10 years.
And then we figure out what we need to do. But this is the first time that we've had a lot of these changes here in a while.
And part of the changes, I think there is a provision that allows you, if you do reduce, you don't necessarily lose this, and I'm speaking to the congressional districts, we won't lose a congressional seat. If they simply went on numbers, more than likely we would have lost a congressional seat, which, it's all about numbers in D.C. And
Right.
if you don't have the numbers, compared to, 40-something representatives in Florida, 38 in California, it's
right.
hard to compete when we have 6 now, and if we went to 5.
Right.
So hopefully, as we continue to make improvements in our tax structure, corporate structure, business, personal income structure, getting people to come back in Louisiana, get our economy back rolling again, get those numbers back, we can keep the congressional district, and maybe more can get another one.
Yeah, add one.
That's
Go from
right.
6 to 7 would be great.
That's right.
And so it's just really interesting process, and I don't know that people always understand it, but coming into, as you guys kind of start this next session, there's a lot of things that are up to discuss, and you've got some really unique things about that. And so we're talking a little bit about this session, and this is a new session that you guys are going into, and you mentioned kind of the 3 weeks of preparation and reviewing everything. Tell us a little bit about what you're expecting and maybe some ideas that you have for some bills that you want to represent.
Sure. So, again, a lot of what I deal with as chairman of appropriation is financial issues, and again, fiscal instruments have to be generated in the House. So not only do we do the budget, but we also do address the surplus funding, the excess funding, and all these different, the judicial budget. I have some legislation on judicial reform as well.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Which I hope to continue, and both in terms of the numbers of judges, appellate court judges, and others. We have a lot of judges in the state. They do a great job. I have the utmost respect for our judicial system, but we have some judges unfairly who their dockets and filings are significantly more than some areas. We have some judges who frankly don't have that much to do in terms of both their filings and the caseload that they have compared to some of these other judges. So the intent is just to make it more equitable, but also
Okay.
more efficient.
A little more balanced.
And working on that. And also with the judicial commission, I'm working on some things with that. But primarily, a lot of the focus, I think, is going to be some of the things that have been related to increasing education, early childhood education, looking at trying to fund that. That's going to be something that's important in terms of the benefit for literacy and education, but also addressing some of the backlog in deferred maintenance for higher education. There's hundreds of millions of dollars that our universities are plagued with, but haven't put off or have been putting off that need to be addressed.
Okay.
And so that's going to be a critical issue in terms of moving forward, how we're going to look at both, funding higher ed,
Right.
but also addressing some of the backlog and maintenance. Because if you look at the overall budget, and we talked about the projected budget for next fiscal year,
Right.
although it is increasing, part of that has to be looking at one-time dollars that we're investing in terms of addressing infrastructure and those one-time dollars. It's going to be difficult to look at expanding programs to a great degree. We have issues with behavioral health, as you know, and
Sure.
others that need attention.
Right.
And there are things that we can and could spend additional dollars on, but we need to be mindful of the fact, as I mentioned, that there's going to be a projected deficit. So focusing on one-time dollars, non-recurring expenses, infrastructure, and other things are going to be the primary focus on how we're going to address or utilize the dollars that are available.
Yeah, and you mentioned some of those things that we didn't never even look at or never maybe think about how higher education's been impacted from COVID.
And one of the issues with higher education, I mean, that is the future. Education is the future for everything in terms
Sure.
of both, from early childhood education, establishing that base for the students into the future, but the higher education, look at the statistics in terms of the numbers of folks with higher ed degrees, with college degrees in terms of both marriage, productivity, jobs, and of course salary and other things, but how important higher education is to the future of our economy and just sustaining our tax base. And that includes our technical college, community and technical college system as well,
Right.
which is important. We have a great system here.
We
Dr.
do.
Strickland and Fletcher do a great job, but also Dr. Monty Sullivan, who oversees the whole technical college system,
Right.
is doing a great job across the state, which is important because, that is, when you look at higher ed, that is higher ed, everybody thinks community college, but no, that is
No,
higher
it
education, which
really
is
is.
important. And all these different types of opportunities are provided to people which are important for local tax bases and our economy and future. But there are problems and issues like anything else, and the problem with what we've done in the past, typically about 15, 20 years ago, a majority of the money that went to universities, there's about a 70-30 split, that 70% came from the state and 30% from tuition, fees, and things like that. Well, over the past 15 years, it's shifted, and now it's 70% from tuition, fees, and everything else, and the contribution to the state. We need to work on trying to get that a little bit closer
To 50-50.
to 50-50, which is better for the university, but more importantly, is better for the state and the people who live here in the state, and it's going to pay dividends. So those are the things that I think we need to continue to focus on and work on into both the next budget. Because again, as you know, we're looking at the budget of about $10 billion. We have statutory dedications in excess of $6.7 billion. And those statutory dedications come right off the top. That's like the matching federal dollars for Medicaid, all the other things that we have to pay.
Right.
So that leaves, for the most part, right around $4 billion that we really have the authority to say grace over. I mean, everybody talks about, well, you need to cut the budget, you need to legislate, you need to do this. Well,
We only
frankly,
have so much we can work
right,
with.
and where do you go? And because of the way, and that's why we need to, again, we can have a whole nother segment on the tax structure and how we budget our
Right.
state. But the problem is the only way we can go to address deficiencies is higher education and Medicaid, because those aren't constitutionally protected or the statutory dedications, and that's unfortunate, and we need to change that. And I think we're working toward that. We made some improvements in the tax structure,
Right.
both personal and corporate, this past legislative session, reducing those rates.
Right.
And that's going to help. But as it continues to improve, we'll look at making some additional adjustments to our budget for the betterment of the state.
Yeah, well, Z, we appreciate all the things that you do, and being on appropriations really helps you have some intimate knowledge about being on those committees and running those committees to kind of give us that insight about where we're going, and gives you a lot more insight about what to do and where we're going. But we appreciate that, and the time and energy. We were just talking about that, the time and energy that's spent being able to do that. And you guys don't get paid nearly enough for the amount of time that you spend really standing up for the people that really need the help. They can't make those decisions for themselves. So we appreciate it very, very much. And so good luck next session.
And thank you very
and
much.
we hope everything that you want to get passed gets passed.
Thank you, sir. And
All
good.
right.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Again, Jerome Zeringue, very glad to have him with us. All right, guys, that will do it for this particular segment of Bayou Time. Don't go anywhere. A lot more local programming when we continue.